Presentations that came before mine were very good in the sense that they kind of were
Talk to the microphone. We can't hear you.
the presentations that came before me were very much a precursor of what I'm going to say, and I think were very good lead-ins. It's difficult for researchers today to imagine what the attitudes were towards qualitative research and chronic conditions 30 to 40 years ago. There were few qualitative methods for researchers to choose from. You could use ethnography, hermeneutics, and a few other kinds of methods, but very few methods were available to qualitative researchers. Furthermore, qualitative research was looked upon with suspicion, dismissed as being too vague, poorly designed. That's what others were saying, not what qualitative researchers said. Lacking in procedures, and worst of all, non-scientific. Needless to say, there was little grant money or academic support for persons wanting to use qualitative methods. The research on chronic conditions was just as limited. Most of the research focused on acute illness, was quantitative, and studied compliance, with a few odd studies on quality of life. There was little insight into the difficulties of living with chronic conditions, interest in their psychosocial impacts, explanations of why compliance or quality of life might be problematic. It was as if persons with chronic conditions existed only as medical entities to be examined, probed, and goaded into compliance. If only quality of life would be theirs, if only they would comply with those darn regimens. Fortunately, the situation has changed somewhat. There are many more qualitative methods to choose from, and greater status given to qualitative researchers. Qualitative researchers have their own journals, text, and conferences such as this one. When it comes to chronic conditions, there is a significant body of knowledge, much of it derived from qualitative studies. There is even greater acknowledgement of the role that psychosocial aspects play into the management and outcomes of chronic conditions. In this presentation, I will talk about Anselm Strauss, one of the early pioneers, and outline his legacy to both qualitative research and... Move closer? Sorry. I'll talk about Anselm Strauss, one of the early pioneers, and outline his legacy both to qualitative research and chronic illness. I'll tell you something about the man, discuss his contributions to qualitative research, and relate his insights into chronic illness. And the reason why I think this is important, because if you're to understand grounded theory the way Anselm Strauss did it, you have to understand where he came from, because where he came from is very much reflected in his method. This is a picture of Anselm Strauss. How well it came. Anselm Strauss was a humanistic, thoughtful, and curious person, a real Renaissance man with a love of art, theater, literature, and music. He used to love to play the piano, especially Beethoven and Schubert. He was not a linear thinker by any means, but arrived at his understandings and conclusions in in a very circular fashion. He saw life as complex, and for that reason believed that cause and effect explanations would not do. He was often referred to by his friends as a rabbi, a teacher who used stories to make a point. At the same time, he was equally good at listening, giving his full attention to his speaker. Though his body had its share of medical problems, his mind remained alert and healthy throughout his life. For him, a novel, an encounter at a party, a conversation with a friend was something to be thought about and analyzed. It was as if his mind was always ingesting, digesting, and comparing, giving him a storehouse of knowledge that he drew upon to solve problems both in his professional and personal life. As a researcher and a teacher, research and teaching were the center of Anselm Strauss's professional life. To my knowledge, he never turned away a student that came to his door unless he was ill. In fact, he thrived on the attention of students and on teaching others. Strauss was actively involved in teaching his research until the day he died. But Strauss wasn't born a teacher or a researcher. Those two aspects of self had a beginning for him just like they did for us. Strauss's worldview, later to be manifested in his approach to analysis, was laid down during his college years. I'll discuss some of those early influences next. His undergraduate years, Strauss did his undergraduate studies at the University of Virginia. There he was introduced to the writings of pragmatists, philosophers such as William James and C.S. Peirce. However, the philosopher who had the greatest influence on Strauss was Dewey. There were four aspects of Dewey's philosophy that I believed had a major impact on Strauss and how he later approached analysis. These were the individual as a thoughtful, self-reflective being who responds to problems through action and interaction, based on reason. Secondly, there was no duality between thinking and doing, both being part of a continuous stream of activity. Third, the world is complex, ever-changing, and subject to contingency. To shape outcomes requires adjustments in action to accommodate to that change. Actions have consequences that must be taken into account in any action scheme. It's interesting to note that though Strauss was deeply impressed by Dewey's philosophy, little of that philosophy can be found in his early writings or research. It seems to have evolved over time and was not fully articulated into a worldview until he wrote the book Continual Permutations of Action, published in 1993, shortly before his death. His graduate education. After completing his undergraduate degree, Strauss attended the graduate school in sociology at the University of Chicago. He was drawn there by the reputation of early sociologists such as W.I. Thomas, Robert Park, and Everett Hughes. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, Chicago was a city with high immigration, crowded conditions, unregulated industries, corruption, and unresolved social problems. For the early sociologists, the overwhelming problems called for a novel approach to data gathering, namely going outside the walls of academia and into the field to find out what was really going on. In doing so, they brought to the university a tradition of reform and an emphasis in field work. Being educated in this environment, it was only natural that Strauss would develop a reform agenda and a lifelong love of field research. Another influence on Strauss was Mead. Strauss embraced Mead's writings because they provided an alternative to the biological deterministic view of the self prevalent at the time. What Strauss took foremost from Mead's philosophy were the following: the role of interaction in the development of the self, that persons act on the basis of meaning, and a broad view of time that brings past and future together in the present. Two books written by Strauss later are worth noting. First, there is his edited book of Mead's writings entitled George Herbert Mead on Social Psychology, published in 1956, and his book called Mirrors and Masks, also published, well, no, that was published in 1969. Another influence on Anselm Strauss was Herbert Blumer. Herbert Blumer was just one among many of Strauss's teachers at Chicago, but one that had a lasting influence. Blumer took Mead's notion of interaction and the formation of self one step further by emphasizing its symbolic nature. Without shared meanings of concepts, people couldn't talk or do things together. It was Blumer who termed the coin symbolic interactionism. Though Blumer often spoke to Strauss about the need for theory and concept development, he never provided a methodological means for doing so. This was left to Strauss to carry out. In summary, after completing his education, Strauss had two major philosophic traditions within him: pragmatism and interactionism, a reform mentality, a vision of theory as the basis for change, but theory based on concepts grounded in data derived from fieldwork methods. After graduating with his doctorate from Chicago, Strauss held a variety of teaching positions. In the late 1950s, he was invited to start doctoral programs in nursing and medical sociology at the University of California in San Francisco. He jumped at the opportunity to work and live in San Francisco, and he and his wife Fran left the East Coast for California, and never looked back. Soon after arriving at UCSF, Strauss applied for and received a grant to study death and dying using fieldwork methods. He enlisted the assistance of a nurse named Jean Quint Ben-O'Leil, a doctoral student in the nursing program. Glaser was another addition to the team. Glaser, a recent doctoral graduate of Columbia University, was returning to the Bay Area and looking for an academic opportunity. I mention this because coming from Columbia, Glaser brought a different dimension to the research project and one of his quantitative background. So the death and dying study was reported on in Glaser and Strauss, Awareness of Dying, published by Chicago Press, the City of Chicago, Aldine Press. I don't even know if Aldine is still around today, is it? No, okay. During their work together, Strauss and Glaser did more than study death and dying. They also worked out a methodology that combined their mutual sociological backgrounds with their diverse approaches to doing research, quantitative and qualitative. The methodology was aimed at developing theory grounded in data, but analyzed by means of comparative analysis. The methodology they developed became known as grounded theory, and it was published in the text, The Discovery of Grounded Theory, and that was also done by Aldine. You have to put the book Discovery, into perspective to understand what it meant. As I mentioned in the introduction, in the early 1960s, there were few qualitative methods available to researchers, especially ones aimed at theory building. Most of the published texts on qualitative methods were oriented towards field work, with little explanation of what to do with the data once you had collected it. Most young researchers learn to do field research and analysis, largely through an apprenticeship with a more experienced researcher. The publication of Discovery was groundbreaking. The book argued against what Glaser and Strauss called armchair theorizing, while emphasizing the need to build theory grounded in concepts derived from data. But most importantly, Discovery provided a set of procedures for analyzing data, something missing from many of the earlier text and field work. The idea behind grounded theory, as it was in the Discovery, was that through a process of constant analysis, concepts are identified and developed in terms of their properties and dimensions. That data are collected using a variety of means, including observation, interview, documents, videos, memoirs, anything that can be useful to the researcher. The analytic procedures were not numerous and included making comparisons, asking questions, writing memos, doing diagrams. Analysis was meant to be open, flexible, dynamic, and proceed based on theoretical sampling. That is, analysis begins with the collection of the first pieces of data. Data are scrutinized and concepts are denoted to stand for that data. The concepts derived from this initial analysis provided the basis for subsequent data collection. Related concepts were then grouped to form categories or themes, which were then developed further through theoretical sampling until reaching what they called saturation. Categories, once they were saturated, are integrated around a core category, categories, an even more abstract concept that represents in a word or two the main finding of the study. And it was this interrelationship between data collection coupled with analysis that really was meant to ground theory, so that, according to Glaser and Strauss, you can't really go out and collect all this information beforehand because you're not able to develop it or to verify your interpretations as you went along, as you could grounding the theory by doing theoretical sampling. Strauss's approach to analysis, and here where we get the divergent paths. Since development of grounded theory methodology was a collaborative effort, it's difficult to separate Glaser and Strauss's unique contributions. Their different approaches to analysis came later with Strauss's analytical approach rooted in his early foundation in Mead and Dewey. And I want to point out that though Glaser and Strauss remained friends and talked through the years, the only research project they carried out jointly was the Death and Dying study. For several years, Glaser taught the qualitative research courses at UCSF, University of California, San Francisco, then left the university to do other work. After Glaser left, Strauss took over the methodology courses. He also engaged in several major research projects in collaboration with other researchers. Over time, Strauss developed his own style of analysis, which was only natural, one that brought his worldview derived from pragmatism and interactionism into the research and analytic process. Strauss's research aim was always to construct a grounded theory. He always followed the basic procedures outlined in Discovery, including making comparisons, writing memos, doing theoretical sampling, and saturation. The difference between he and Glaser, where they existed, was in Strauss's approach to analysis. As I said, his being a direct reflection of his worldview. Though Strauss had Strauss taught using his own style. It was not until he published Qualitative Analysis for Social Scientists in 1987 that any differences between the two men became noticeable. The following point summarizing Strauss' orientation toward analysis brings out his pragmatist and interactionist foundation. Action and action stand at the heart of analysis. Action is not static but process, and changes occur over time in relationship to changes in conditions. Action and action may be planned or spontaneous. Action and interaction are based on meanings that persons give to the events and situations they encounter. And as you hear these or see these, you can see his interactionist and pragmatist foundation really coming through in how he approached his analysis, which was very action-oriented. Action and interaction always occur within a complex context of micro and macro conditions. Action and interaction lead to consequences that become part of subsequent action and interaction. Process denotes action and interaction over time in response to problems and situations. As contextual conditions change, there's a corresponding change in action in order to adapt. Glaser's objections to Strauss were not voiced, at least publicly, until the publication of Basics of Grounded Theory, written by Strauss and myself. The book rapidly gained popularity, probably because it attempted to take a very complex analytic process and break it down into something more understandable for beginning analysts. What I assumed happened was that Glaser realized for the first time that Strauss had his own way of doing things. And he probably felt that publication of the book written by Strauss and myself took something meaningful away from him. Glaser objected to the use of the paradigm and the conditional matrix, claiming that we structured analysis too much and forced data analysis. Here I think the fault can be found in how we explain the matrix in the paradigm in Basics of Grounded Theory. The paradigm and matrix are nothing more than heuristic devices. They come right out of Strauss's worldview about the world. Since the world is complex, it's important to capture some of that complexity in the research. The paradigm is there to remind researchers that action and interaction stand at the heart of analysis. Action and interaction must be located in context, that it is subject to contingency and ever-changing. Since all action and interaction lead to consequences, researchers should be looking for these and relating them back to action. The matrix, on the other hand, was meant to help students realize the complexity of situations and the wide range of micro and macro conditions that enter into context. Researchers should be able to trace relationships between contextual conditions and relate them back to action. Over the years, grounded theory method has had its share of criticisms beyond Glaser. New researchers have put their own twist on the method, often in response to those criticisms. I would say today that there is no one grounded theory, but different versions of the method built around the original one. That is the ever-changing nature of things. Change means something that Strauss talked much about. True, grounded theory has evolved for better and sometimes worse. It's easy to get caught up in all the arguments and methodological discussions. What is important is that we don't lose sight of Strauss's and Glaser's contribution. Without that fateful meeting between the two men in the death and dying study, there would probably be no methodology today known as grounded theory. Though Strauss's approach to analysis differs somewhat from Glaser, there is a core method that has endured and that has resulted in countless research projects throughout the world. Strauss has played a major role in grounded theory's development and its continued use through his research, teaching, and publications. But our story about Strauss is not over yet. It was through grounded theory that Strauss had made many of his major contributions to the area of chronic illness, and I turn to that next. That part is short, part became reform. Throughout his life, Strauss was plagued with mild to serious chronic conditions. As a child, he developed sinus problems that led to chronic bronchitis, resulting in countless regimens. In his 40s, he had a major heart attack while traveling in France that did severe damage to his heart and imposed considerable limitations in physical ability. Witnessing illness in family members, friends, and self, Strauss developed considerable understanding of the problems of persons living with chronic condition and compassion for their fate. What really bothered him were the problems of access, the paternalistic, dehumanizing, and compartmentalizing approaches he saw in medical care, the lack of understanding by medical professionals regarding the psychosocial impact of long-term illnesses and disability had on persons. Strauss's arrival at UCSF with its medical and nursing schools provided him with the opportunity to do research and teach about chronic illness. One of his first duties was to guide doctoral students through their dissertations. Many of his students chose to study one or another chronic conditions using grounded theory. Strauss also taught courses on chronic illness. As part of his coursework, students were asked to bring case examples from their work to hospitals and clinics into the classroom for discussion. Most importantly, Strauss engaged in a program of research that examined chronic illness care in hospitals and home. I think that what made Strauss and his colleagues' work so valuable is that it made us think. I think it made us think about what long-term illness and disability mean for the persons living with those conditions. Though what I have to say next seems very obvious and taken for granted today, you have to remember that when Strauss and his colleagues were doing the research, the whole notion of chronicity and associated problems were hardly given notice. It took a long time before the acute care mentality, with its notion of cure, gave way to a recognition that chronic illness and disability are long-term, and because they have long-term, the problems associated with them are more than the medical problems. The work of Strauss and his colleagues can be summarized as such. Chronic conditions are long-term, sometimes lasting until death. Chronic conditions are often have disabling or uncomfortable symptoms that must be managed through regimens. Chronic conditions often bring with them visible and invisible disabilities that can threaten identity and the development of self. Chronic conditions have a course, and that course must be managed. And the course he conceptualized as a trajectory with a past, a present, and a future. Over the trajectory of course, an illness is likely to pass through several different phases, each with varying symptoms and a need for management. The phases include the pre-illness, onset of symptoms, diagnostic period, acute period, stable period, unstable, comeback, downward in death and dying. And persons didn't necessarily follow a straight path going through all of these phases, but came and went. Sometimes they had an acute period and then go back to a stable period, could go through a comeback only to end up going downward very rapidly and going to death and dying. Another important part of it was that different persons are involved in the care of persons with chronic conditions, depending upon the status and phase. Sometimes chronic care took place in the home and sometimes in the hospital. However, Regardless of where it was taking place, he saw the home as the center of care because that is where most of the work of chronic conditions takes place. Also, chronic conditions bring about role changes and that families struggle to maintain some degree of normality. But I think also important for him, and most important for my own research, is that persons, family, and medical personnel have biographies in everyday lives. And these two have to be managed at the same time you're trying to manage an illness. And that biography in everyday life needs have the potential to affect the management of chronic conditions and therefore medical outcomes. Conversely, medical conditions have a significant impact on the self-biography in everyday life. And that when persons have chronic conditions, they have to live with uncertainty, undergo sometimes painful diagnostic tests and treatments, reorder everyday life and biographical time, prevent and handle crises, carry out regimens, manage disabilities, and so on. But why is an understanding of all of this came out of this research on conditions, and why is this important? To quote Strauss, "The common problems are complex and need to be studied and their implications thought through. Without understanding a great deal about how the chronically ill get through their days outside of health facilities, health personnel will never understand what they really need to know to give effective care at the facilities and to ensure that patients will not return more quickly than they should." I can go on detailing the results of all of the studies that were done by Strauss, his students, and research associates. I'm certain that their combined research efforts have contributed to a greater understanding of what it means to live with chronic conditions and have led to improvement in the lives of persons so afflicted. Perhaps most importantly, Strauss has shown us what can happen when a researcher puts together a method like grounded theory or any form of field research with a problem like chronic illness. It could change the way people act and the way people think. The legacy of Anselm Strauss will continue to impact researchers for years to come. Strauss has left us a methodology for building theory that is action and interaction oriented. It is a methodology that consists of a set of well-integrated and developed concepts that is richly contextualized and that captures change over time. In addition, Strauss has given us a body of knowledge about chronic conditions that keeps the medical in place while placing equal emphasis on the social and psychological impacts. It's up to us to take the method, in fact all field methods, and use them to extend the boundaries of knowledge and about issues that are important to us, and in doing so create our own legacies. Thank you. I guess what comes next?
I think that we still have a few minutes for questions. If there are any questions, so it's an opportunity. Okay, please, if you can stand up when, yeah.
Thank you, Professor. I'm wondering, how did Strauss feel about the second generation grounded theory, particularly Chalmers and Clark's work, and it became something else after their publications.
Anselm Strauss was a man who felt change was inevitable. It was something that happened over time, and that it was only natural that each person who picked up and did grounded theory would develop their own style of doing it, an own way of doing it. And I think that every researcher who does grounded theory approaches analysis in their own way, brings their own self into the process. And so he never really talked about it. I'm not sure what year her book was published, although I've had it and I've referenced it, so I know. But he may have died before it was actually published.
It was 2006, but she published an article in 2000.
Yeah, but I think he died, in 1996, was it? So it was before. But I don't think he would have had a problem because, like I said, he was very open, very flexible, and really saw that there was no really one grounded theory, that it was a method that was meant to be used the way people felt or worked with it in their own way. Yes.
Can theories that emerge from field research, but was in an interaction with existing theories, it can't be considered grounded theory?
Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yes, that was by the way the question that I was asked.
Do you want to come here and take the mic in order for the other people in your
I'll sit down because it will take me time to go. I'm asking this question because this is the question that I was asked in my PhD viva. And they, the committee argued with me, okay, that it wasn't grounded theory because I was relying on existing theory. I did, develop a new theory. But because I integrated and partially based, my theory, both on data that emerged that are collected in the field and from existing theory, it wasn't considered grounded theory. And I would love to hear what you
You got your PhD, right? It seems that she developed her doctoral dissertation encompassed both doing field work and using existing theories as the basis for developing her theory. And that her theory was therefore a combination of these two forms of data. I don't see it really as problematic since you use the existing theories as data and not necessarily as the concepts that you began with and that you examined as part of your theory. So what did you tell them? Because you can use, and Strauss used a variety of methods or not methods, but used a variety of sources of data. So if you used it as data, I don't see it as a problem. Okay. Yes.
I want to take a very risky position, especially after hearing the lecture about the promotion process. So please keep it inside.
Oh, we'll see. What was your name?
Albert Einstein.
Okay.
Which is no guarantee at my university. I want to propose, or I want to express my own feeling that as I get older, I feel that there's no difference, really, between induction and deduction. That there's no real difference between quantitative research and qualitative research. What would Anselm Strauss say to the proposition that there's no difference between acute care and chronic care, and that life itself is a chronic condition?
you don't see any difference between quantitative and qualitative?
Less and less.
In what way?
Well, every quantitative study, even if it's longitudinal, involves induction from one stage to the next. And that induction invariably brings in qualitative aspects.
Sure.
And therefore, I'm beginning to think that while distinctions are important, and maybe it's just my own muddled mind, but I've gotten as far as I've gotten being muddled. I'm beginning to wonder whether the distinctions are less important than the combinations and blurring the distinctions.
Well, I can see where you're coming from, and in many ways I agree with you in the sense that even when we do qualitative work, we kind of try to take our work back to our participants to kind of validate. When you're doing constant comparisons, you're trying to validate one piece with another. So you're doing some testing. It's just that you're testing within the process of doing the research versus, collecting all your data first. And I think that much of the quantitative research comes out of a qualitative aspect of noting something or observing something. I would say they're related, maybe not quite the same, but related, and that both have elements of each in it, in a sense. But many people who do qualitative work do some counting, and now are combining quantitative with qualitative methods. As far as chronic illness and acute illness, I think that the one aspect that differs so much is the psychosocial impact that it can have on self. Whereas an acute condition, once it's done, it's over with. If you get the flu, you get the flu.
Really?
Well, hopefully you're finished with it by the time you get it. Hopefully. Or if you have appendicitis, they take out your appendix and your...
But that interacts with the rest of your existence, and it's interaction.
Well, it's part of your biography, if you mean it that way, yes.